While our speaker is playing with the chart, I just want to bring to your attention once more the beautiful things happening in the metro area to help us to become a whole human being. And we mentioned last night that next month, November the 4th, there is an excellent conference presented by a Christian Asian theologian, Kosuke Koyama. It is presented at St. Mary's University at their main auditorium, November the 4th, Monday, on an ecumenical interpretation of the I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then a week later, next month, November 8 and 10, there is a conference retreat on meditation in the Christian and the Buddhist traditions with 4 experienced people. And that's taking place also at St. Mary's University in the auditorium. And I was informed that at the Mother House, on top of the hill here, the Pentagon, spiritual Pentagon, there is Abbot David Geratz, who is a Benedictine, will speak on the healing power of the Holy Spirit on October 25 to 26, 27th. So there are many excellent activities taking place to help us to open our mind to the total reality of God, whose center is everywhere and whose periphery is nowhere. And I would like now to invite our friend, Reverend Robert Faricy, to pursue his sharing with us of his experience in the contemplative journey. And this afternoon, he will try to make us open to Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Thomas Merton. Each one of them could take a century of development, but he will do all of them in 1 hour.
Gilbert Keith Chesterton has said that anything worth doing at all is worth doing poorly. So that's why I'm trying to talk about these 3 great writers in 1 hour. Yep, because I want to stop after I go on too long. And it's way too much. And I realized that just this morning, that this is too much for 1 hour. But what I've decided to do is to oversimplify everything. And I'm telling you that right away. I'm oversimplifying, but that's okay. We can learn from oversimplifications as long as we know that there's a certain amount of oversimplification going on. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross are complementary. It's really the same school. They were both Carmelites. They're the 2 principal figures at the beginning of the 16th century reform of the Carmelite orders, men and women respectively. They're both doctors of the church, and they're both great saints and great mystics. Thomas Merton, who died less than 30 years ago, was a Trappist monk, a convert, and he's quite different from the Carmelite tradition, so that it isn't like 3 different models. These 2 models, Teresa of Avila, if you guys in back would come closer, you could read the board and probably be prepared and not flunk the brief quiz at the end of this lecture. How do you know I'm not going to do it? John of the Cross and Teresa are complementary. It's the same school. Their doctrine, their personalities are entirely different. And so their experiences were a little different, but the doctrine is about the same. Thomas Merton is quite distinct, certainly well within the Christian and even Roman Catholic tradition, but original. They're all originals, but these two had a big influence on one another, and they're saying kind of the same things, at least they're in the same framework. What do these three writers have in common? And in fact, all of the great writers in the Christian mystical tradition, in the tradition of contemplative prayer, all of them have this. They're not really metaphysical. And in that sense, they're not philosophical. They're not even, by most reckonings, theological. They're descriptive. And what they're describing is their experience. Teresa of Avila is notorious for never having reread what she wrote. And even if she thinks she might have written something before, rather than go back and read it, she'll just say, well, I might have said this before, but I'll say it again. Then she just repeats herself. Well, John of the Cross is famous for never having finished any of his major works. He just stopped. I mean, the book stopped right in the middle of a page. Boom, that's it. Nobody ever had the courage to finish them. They're both geniuses. But what they're geniuses at doing is describing their own mystical experience, their own experience of contemplative prayer. And that's why their writings help so many people. Teresa of Avila wrote a lot of books because she wrote fast and she never reread anything. So her greatest book is the one she wrote at the end of her life. It's called The Interior Castle. I recommend it. John of the Cross wrote a lot of books. They're all great. And I suppose The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night of the Soul are his two most famous, and they're good. They're brilliant. Thomas Merton, true to the Carmelite tradition, only in this, that he didn't finish his best book. He died too soon. And he really did die too soon. What he might have done, I don't know, but he died and he was way too young. He was electrocuted in Bangkok just after or just before giving a lecture. His best book is called Contemplative Prayer, and in some libraries it's under the title The Climate of Monastic Prayer. You probably have it here under both titles. Most libraries do. It was published posthumously, and he never finished it. And the book is kind of a mess. You can get some wrong impressions from reading it. It can even be a little dangerous, but it's great. It's an unfinished book. He intended to revise it, and Father Basil Pennington told me that he and Merton had planned to get together and revise contemplative prayer and fix it up, because it's kind of a patchwork book. And they never got the chance because Merton died before he could finish the book. So the publishers published it as it was, but it's still good, contemplative prayer. So let's talk about them. Oversimplifying, I'm going to just say what Teresa of Avila thinks contemplative prayer is, and then talk about the interior castle in a very oversimplified way. What's contemplative prayer? It's taking the time to be with the one with a capital O that I know loves me. That's it. Being with the Lord. So we're talking here basically about non-conceptual prayer of the heart, which can be a fairly dark and murky and obscure business. Knowing the Lord is not like knowing your neighbor next door, but as a matter of fact, in Teresa's life it wasn't so dark. A lot went on. Some people would say too much. She sees the soul, by the way, all of these people, but especially John and Teresa, what they're interested in is describing their experience as development, going from A to Z in mental prayer, you might say. What's the evolution? What's the trajectory of prayer? What's that trajectory that the ordinary person, more or less, allowing for individual differences, follows in the development of that person's prayer life, granted that the person is faithful to prayer and to the Lord in prayer every day or almost every day. Teresa looks at it this way. She says, imagine your soul, that is you, right? Imagine yourself spiritually as a big castle. So it's pretty hard to do, and I've never managed to do it. But try it anyway. It's like you're like this big thing, see, circular building, like the mother house maybe. You're like the mother house up there of the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul, and in this large mother house there are many rooms, which she calls mansions, and they're arranged in a concentric way. At the center is the Lord, Jesus Christ. He's at the center. There he is, Jay. Can you see it? You guys in back can't see it. You flunked. This is Jesus. And then you come into this big castle. This is the interior castle. That's what it is. That's where the book gets its name. You come in and you're in the first mansions. That is the first set of rooms. These are all rooms. You're in one of these rooms here on the outer circle, and you're just kind of getting started. You're finding out Jesus loves you. You're starting to pray a little bit, saying some prayers, maybe the rosary, some set prayers. Then you get into the second concentric circle, which is the second group of rooms, the second mansions. And there things are getting a little better. You're starting to have more effective prayer. And then you get into the third set of rooms, mansions, the third mansions, and that's where your prayer starts to get simpler. It goes from affective prayer, acts of faith, hope, love, sorrow for sin, whatever, accepting God's love, trust, acts of trust, maybe, hope, faith, and you're here, and it goes from affective prayer in these third mansions to a much simpler prayer. And your prayer becomes very simplified and pretty much just a being with the Lord, being with the One, taking time with the One that you know loves you. The beginnings of properly contemplative prayer start here at the end of the third mansions and moving in to the fourth. So once you're in, how you doing there? Good. Once you're in the fourth mansions and fifth and sixth and seventh, which is the center, you're in contemplative prayer. It begins here at the end of the third mansions. Normally, the fourth mansions is a time of a certain amount of trial and difficulty, interior but also exterior. It's a time of darkness to some extent and of dryness. Okay, parenthetical remark. If you read The Interior Castle, and when you read it by Teresa of Avila, you find out that she's having all these ecstasies, visions. God is talking to her. She's having locutions, all kinds of things. But she's describing her own experience. Are those things necessary? No, and they're not even advisable. Don't have them if you can avoid them. But she puts them in the book because their spiritual director said, write a book, describe your experience. So she's describing her experience, and she had these things. And she sort of thinks that, well, here you have some visions, and here in the fifth mansion you have more, and so on. That was her experience. What's been the experience of the church? It's that anybody can have visions, locutions, and what was the other one? Ecstasies and all that theatrical fireworks. You can have that in your prayer, but it doesn't really depend on where you are. It doesn't depend on what stage of prayer, or even if you're not in contemplative prayer. How many people here have ever had a charismatic experience, like baptism of the Holy Spirit and all that? All right, so you know. a prophecy is just like a locution, except you tell it to other people. People are having them every day in charismatic prayer groups. And not to mention visions and not to mention locutions. It's not so uncommon. You find people that are back here in the second mansions or the third that have spectacular stuff. On the other hand, many people, and most, I would say, the vast majority, go right through up to the center of the soul where the Lord is king and where he resides. They work right through the sixth mansions up to the seventh without having anything very spectacular happen. No locutions, no visions, no words from God, no personal prophecies, no levitation, and no big deal. That would be pretty common. So that the special effects are not so important. The trouble with reading The Interior Castle is that the special effects, they're kind of, wow, all this happened to her, ecstasies, she's, they're peeling her off the ceiling. Boy, she's really got, well, yeah, but that isn't so important. That was just her. That gives you some idea of the kind of a woman she was. Actually, I think a fairly theatrical woman. Pretty dramatic. Anyway, that doesn't always happen, and it doesn't happen very often. The third and fourth mansions are important, and this is pretty much my own experience, because a lot of people kind of get stuck here. They kind of get stuck, especially religious men and women, no offense intended. A lot of people kind of get stuck there, and you wonder why. And people do wonder why, and I'm going to give a tentative answer. Why don't they go on to the fifth, sixth, and seventh mansions? How come they're kind of stuck on the bridge between the third and the fourth? They're kind of into contemplative prayer a little bit. Their prayer's pretty dark. They feel kind of numb, maybe like a vegetable. Once in a while they slip back and out of contemplative prayer, then they cross the bridge and they slip back into the fourth mansions. They're back in it. How come they never get on to the fifth mansions? Why is that? The fifth mansions is usually, this isn't in Teresa, but it's my experience. The fifth mansions is usually pretty short. It's a transitional period. It might last a month, 2 months, maybe maximum a year and a couple months. The fourth, you can be in the fourth mansions, even the third, the fourth especially for years. And you can be in the fifth a short time, and then you're in the sixth for years too. The fifth is usually, it's a happy time. I'll talk about it in a minute. Why do people get stuck between 3 and 4? Right on the edge of contemplative prayer, slipping in and out of it. Why? Well, I'll tell you frankly, I don't know. But I think, and this is my opinion, I was going to say humble opinion, but not so humble really. I think that they're blinded by their own complacency. They think where they are is okay, they don't care. They want to be respectable. They're kind of suffocated by their own respectability and blinded by their own complacency. They're good people, they're praying every day, so they're all right. It's kind of too bad, though. It's kind of too bad. And after a long time, maybe, or maybe not so long, but usually pretty long, years maybe, in the fourth mansions, a person will pass into the fifth. How do you get into the fifth mansions? It's a happier time, your prayer's more consoling, you find the Lord, you have a certain facility in being in relationship to the Lord. Good things happen, too bad it's such a short time, but it's a pretty good time for prayer. I've found that people get into this in one of 3 ways. The first way is the most common. Somebody will be praying. I'm thinking of a friend of mine, a woman. She was just in this fourth thing for a long time, some years, and then in her prayer the Lord just started to things started to change. She was more aware of the Lord. She was much more conscious of His presence, and above all, conscious of how much He loved her. And so her prayer changed and her whole personality changed. I was her spiritual director. And people said to me, how about call her Betty? Have you noticed the big change in Betty? Yeah. What do you think is the cause of that? I don't know. But I know The cause was she'd passed the threshold in her relationship with the Lord. She'd moved from the fourth mansions of Teresa of Avila into the fifth, a happier time, a time when you're more aware of the Lord. Too bad it doesn't last so long, because after a while you go into the sixth and you're back in a certain period of darkness, pretty much like the fourth mansions, except it's worse. Darker. It's not all dark, but it's pretty dark. And then after a while, if you're good and you live long enough, you get into the center where the Lord is, and then it's kind of a stable peace, and nothing too much bothers you, because you've been around the block, or one might say through the castle. All right. That's Teresa of Avila. Notice that for her, and I think she's got a real great point, it's Jesus Christ. That's the one that you know loves you the most, and he's there in the center of your soul, and you're trying to be in the closest possible union with him, but it's all grace. He does it. It's not what I do, it's what he does. I try to be faithful, I try to be there every day, try to be with the Lord, but in the end it's what the Lord does, isn't it? It's all gift, it's all grace. And it is Jesus Christ, true man and true God. The reason I say that is I've been reading some authors lately that say when you get into the higher reaches of contemplation, you sort of pre-sin, if I may use a big word with only two syllables. You pre-sin from the humanity of Christ, and you're more just thinking about the divinity of Christ. Well, apart from the difficulty of prescinding from somebody's humanity, I mean, how do you prescind from somebody's humanity? You're going to prescind from my humanity? I mean, even if I were a more ethereal person, it'd still be pretty hard, wouldn't it? I can't no, you don't prescind from people's humanity. This is God, but he's become human. He's got a human nature. I can't dispense or prescind from your human nature, and you can't prescind from mine. Jesus Christ is he's the one. For Teresa of Avila, she gets pretty angry when she runs across people that are saying you can dispense with the humanity of Jesus. How are you going to dispense with his humanity? He's human. He's totally human, also divine. And he's the center of your prayer. And you can be here in the center of the interior castle, in the center of your soul where the Lord is, and you can be a great mystic and a great contemplative, one of the greatest, but it's still him. It's still Jesus. You don't prescind from his humanity. I mean, it's him. Did I kind of render the idea? No. Are you getting the point? I was reading this author who says that Zen meditators and Christian contemplators do the same thing, because after all, the Zen people get pretty much to the essence of God, of the Supreme Absolute, which I think the good ones do, and the Christian prescinds from the humanity of Christ and goes right to the divinity. No, he doesn't prescind from anything. Jesus Christ is everything or he's nothing. And if he's nothing, the hell with it. If he's everything, then that's pretty important. And it's him. He's true God, true man. You can't take him apart. Okay. John of the Cross. How am I doing on time? Terrible. John of the Cross, he's got a little different approach. Same stuff. And he's, one way or another, those 7 mansions are in there, although maybe not so explicitly. What he's interested in is particularly what happens in the 4th and in the 6th mansions. He's especially interested in those. Not exclusively, but especially. And he wrote The Living Flame of Love and some other things about the 7th. Can you see those? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can't argue with that, can you? All right, so in the 4th mansions and in the 6th mansions, what happens is those are times of darkness, or John would say, night. The dark night, and that's why he wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. That's why he wrote that book, to describe what happens in the nights. It's a little confusing when you read The Dark Night of the Soul, because he talks about the active night of the soul and the passive night of the soul. But active is asceticism. It's just trying to get your life in order and be detached from inordinate attachments. That's the active night. You can be overly attached, not just to chocolates and sleeping late, but also to consolations in prayer and having things go on in your prayer that make you feel good. You can be attached to that too. So these 2 nights, one in the 4th and one in the 6th mansions, this is the passive night of the senses, and this is the passive night of the spirit. And once you get through the passive night of the spirit, you get into the center where the Lord is king, and you're over here at where I put J, the center of the castle. Say you're a spiritual director and somebody comes in and this person describes pretty much their prayer, and you think this person is in a night. How do you know if they're in the night of the senses or the night of the spirit? Well, my experience is you don't. But it doesn't make any difference, because a person's comportment has got to be pretty much in either one of them. In these nights, I got a few things to say about them. If you're in one or the other of these 2 nights, and it doesn't matter which one, because they feel pretty much the same, I think. And I can't tell the difference when I meet people. So most people in contemplative prayer, not so many people are in here, this 5th mansion, because that's a fairly transitory one. It doesn't last too long. A year plus at most. A few months, even a few weeks. Most people are in contemplative prayer. Not enough people get here to 7, but more than you would think do. More than you would think. All right, I'm up here at the Mother House, right? I'm up here at the Mother House of the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul. A priori, and I can speak freely. I've only been there a few days. I don't know I know one, but but I don't know most of them very well. I can tell you right away, a priori, a whole bunch of those sisters that are, well, most of them are over 35, let's say. A whole bunch of those sisters are here in the 7th mansions, and they're sitting out here now, some of them listening to me and saying, not me, I'm not worthy, because they all think they're not worthy. Well, that's what Mae West said to the girl, right? The girl said, in My Little Chickadee, I think it was, that movie, the maid says to me, my goodness, what a beautiful diamond. And Mae says, dearie, goodness had nothing to do with it. Goodness has nothing to do with it. Worthiness doesn't even enter into the equation. It's the unworthy people that the Lord approves of the most. Did you know that? The Pharisee and the publican, isn't it? Scribes and prostitutes are going into the kingdom of heaven before us. All right, it's the unworthy people that make it there. It's precisely the ones that think they're not worthy that turn out to get to the center, to the 7th mansions. These nights, they behave pretty much the same. They're dark. And what do you do in the night? Well, you do what you can. When the lights are out, you kind of fumble around and try to do the best you can, hoping that they'll go on at a later date, which they do. The lights are out, but I know that the Lord is there in the dark, and so I don't get upset. The thing to do in a dark night is to be at peace. You know the Lord is there. You know through faith that He's there. You can't see Him, hear Him, touch Him, feel Him. You don't have any awareness to speak of His presence except maybe once in a while, and maybe not even then. And you're like a vegetable, and you're numb, and nothing much seems to be happening. Okay, He's there. You know it. So take it easy. You have to let the Lord love you the way He wants to love you at the time. That's all there is to it. So those are the nights. Sometimes these get confused a little bit with what Ignatius of Loyola calls, I'm not going to write anymore, I ran out of room, what Ignatius calls desolation. Desolation in the Christian Catholic tradition of prayer, desolation means I'm upset. It means I can't handle it. I'm depressed, or I'm angry, or I'm upset in some way. I'm down. And so my prayer is pretty awful because I'm trying to relate to the Lord and I'm angry, or I'm depressed, or something. I feel I'm overwhelmed by guilt feelings. Some negative feelings here are disturbing my prayer. That's not what I'm talking about. You have to distinguish dryness, a dark night, a desert experience in your prayer, you have to distinguish that from desolation. It's not the same thing. And you don't handle them the same way. I can be in desolation and in darkness at the same time. Okay, then I got a problem. What do you do with desolation? You try to get rid of it. You're better off without being depressed or angry or whatever it is. You try to work through it. And if you can't work through it, and lots of times you can't, you're just feeling kind of an anguish in your prayer or unworthiness before God or I don't know what, and you can't work through it. You just have to wait till it passes. That's all. You wait till it goes away. Jesus felt it in the agony in the garden. That was certainly the highest possible degree of desolation. I mean, he sweated blood. So he's been through it. So it's not all bad. It just feels terrible. And he felt terrible too. What do you try to do with desolation? You try to get through it. You try to work through it. You try to get rid of it. You wait it out if you have to. What do you do in the night? You accept it. If it's just darkness and dryness and numbness and lack of awareness of the Lord's presence and feeling like, where are you, Lord? Wake up, as the psalm says. The psalm imagines God in a boat and he's asleep. And it happened in the New Testament, right? Jesus was asleep in the boat. And so they woke him up. So sometimes you want to say, wake up, Lord. You can say it, but he's not going to wake up till he's ready. And he's not going to turn on the lights till he's ready to turn them on. He's going to do what's best for you. So the night, you accept it, you stay there, you let the Lord love you the way he wants to at the time. It's not the same as desolation, although you can have both at the same time. That's John of the Cross's big contribution. Again, as I say, I'm oversimplifying, and this man, both of those are real geniuses. I'm not doing them justice. Thomas Merton, who is a person of our own time, born in England, lived in France, became an American citizen, died in Bangkok. He's a pretty international person. His best book is Contemplative Prayer. I'm just going to talk about a few things. I was going to say, I'm not going to say it, but I was going to say that he was heavily influenced by his readings on Zen and by conversations with Zen Buddhists, and especially by reading, corresponding with, and talking with D.T. Suzuki, Daitet Suzuki, who was the man who made Japanese Renzai Zen well known and popular in English-speaking countries. I was going to say that. But the fact is, I think now, it's not so much that Zen had an influence on him as that he discovered himself in Zen. Thomas Merton had his experience of prayer, just as Teresa and John did. Merton had his experience of contemplative prayer, and when he started reading Zen authors, especially Suzuki, but also others, he found the concepts and the ideas that would express to himself and to other people his own experience of contemplative prayer. And so, as a matter of fact, what he has to say resembles Zen, but it's quite different because it is in the end Catholic. And you will bear with me while I return for the first time to my notes. Don't you hate guys that don't follow their notes? Okay, here I am. When Thomas Merton begins his itinerary, you might say, of writing on mystical experience, he's fairly classical, and he follows especially John of the Cross. And then he evolves over the years. He gets some ideas of his own, especially this idea of the true self. And then he discovers Zen, and it kind of comes together for him. What is this idea of the true self that Merton has? That's his model of contemplation. It's that what I really want to get to is my true self, as opposed to my false and empirical self. What's my false self? It's the self that I normally experience in everyday life. It's myself as I know myself and other people know me. That's not the real me. This is Merton. I agree with it, but it happens to be Merton. The real me is who? The real me is me rooted ontologically and really in Jesus Christ risen at the center of my heart. That's the real me. The real me is me plus Jesus. The real me is me as rooted and grounded in Jesus Christ who lives in me. That's it. That's the real me. That's my real self. And so what I'm trying to get to here in contemplation is to get in touch with my real self. In other words, to have more of an experience of my union with Jesus. That's what I want. So for Merton, contemplative prayer is not so much experiencing Jesus directly. I guess that we have to wait till we die for that. Contemplative prayer is experiencing my union with Jesus, knowing that I'm there with him. And even our union, he and I might be indistinctly perceived by me in this union. I know that I'm not him. I'm not God to begin with. And I'm not a Jewish carpenter or mason or whatever he was, and I haven't risen from the dead. So I'm certainly not Jesus. The distinction is clear. But what I'm perceiving, what I'm aware of through faith, murkily, darkly, in my contemplative prayer, is that we are in union. And so I might not see too clearly the distinction between Jesus and between me. That's what Merton calls the true self. That's the real me. That's my true self. Myself in union with Jesus. Really and truly in union with Jesus. And that's who I am. And I want to get down to that. And I just hope that the Lord, through his providence for me and through the sufferings I undergo, helps me to work through the various layers like an onion of my true self, of my false self, to get to my true self. But does he have a doctrine of the night? Not exactly, because he didn't experience it. What did he experience? Okay, I'm going to talk about darkness in the experience of Merton's contemplative prayer and desolation, because he had both. In the first place, he was a pretty neurotic guy. Teresa of Avila doesn't have a neurotic bone in her body. John of the Cross was a little weird, like some short men. You've probably met them. No offense. I'm short myself and I'm shrinking. But he was very normal. If anything, super normal. Little eccentric, but very normal. Merton is neurotic. He's a neurotic guy, so therefore, I would say a mystic for our age. If there was ever an age of neurosis and an age for neurotics, we're living in it, no question. He was a pretty neurotic guy. He had trouble loving. Right up until the last 5 or 6 years of his life, he just had trouble accepting love, understanding love, and loving other people. You could go back to his childhood. He had a troubled childhood. A lot of bad things happened in his family, and to him and to other members of his family. It was difficult. There are a lot of psychological reasons and possible explanations of why he was neurotic and why he had trouble accepting love and loving. The fact is, that's the way he was. And God, after all, loves us the way we are, not the way we might have been in another possible future or another possible life. He loves us the way we are, and he loved Merton the way he was. And so Merton was a real contemplative, no question. He may not have made it all the way to the 7th mansions, but he was certainly in the 6th, and I kind of think that's my own impression, and I'm just guessing, is that that's where he was when he died. He was in that long period of time called the dark night of the soul before he saw light at the end of the tunnel, and he died before he could, and then of course after he died he saw it. So where he was mostly is in darkness. He likes John of the Cross because John of the Cross is a man that writes a lot about darkness. But Merton's darkness was often, not always, but often, especially I think in the later years of his life, also complicated by real desolation, by a kind of anguish of soul. And he calls that dread. And for him, that's the dark night. Dread is, well, it's like this. Cyril of Alexandria, the great father of the church, says there's only one road, and the dragon sits by the side of the road. but it's the only road you've got, and you have to go by the dragon. The dragon is dread. What is it? Well, it's kind of a dread. I'm there in prayer. I'm there with the Lord. I'm in darkness, but besides the darkness, I feel a big abyss between us, and I feel that he's an abyss. He's like a void, and I can't relate to him because I'm unworthy. I feel guilty because of my life. I've got this kind of a superannuated reverence, that's a fear of God, you might say, fear of the Lord. I'm afraid. It's dread. I come to God with dread. And there's a period in my life, and there were periods in Merton's life. It might be one period. It might be one period broken up into different parts, as it was for Merton. There are times in my life when my prayer is just trying to work through this dread. Well, what useful purpose does that serve then? Why does God permit that in my prayer? It helps to strip off the false self and get down to the true self. There's only one road, and you got to go by the dragon. If that makes any sense. It does to me. That's why I keep repeating it. Well, I don't think he was entirely out of that when he died. I don't think so. Is this model worth anything? It's worth a lot. Why? Because this is his experience, and it corresponds to the experience, the contemplative experience of a lot of people. If it does correspond to your experience, then read Contemplative Prayer, remembering what I said. You can read Contemplative Prayer and think that Merton is just talking, and scholarly articles have been written about Merton's book, and I think it's his masterpiece. Most people would say that, even though it's as a book, it's not worth much. As teaching, it's great. But you can misunderstand it. You can think that he's reducing contemplation to solipsism, to navel-gazing, to doing what people used to think that the Zen meditators did, just looking at their navel. It turns out they're doing quite a bit more than that, and they're not doing even that. And neither was Merton. He's not just in touch with his own self. He's in touch with his true self, which is himself in union with Jesus Christ at the center of his soul. It's a real Catholic, Christian doctrine of contemplation. It describes his experience, and it doesn't describe everyone's experience, but it does describe the experience of a lot of people. A lot of people. And if it describes yours, then he's a good man to read, and that's a good model of contemplation. Well, Merton has certain affinities with Zen, and the Zen people really like him. For one thing, a lot of Zen meditation takes place in darkness. Much more, I think, than most people's Christian contemplation. And Merton writes this, on the psychological level, and we're talking always here on the psychological level. This is descriptive. It's a phenomenological description of progress in contemplative prayer that all three of these people are doing in their models of contemplative prayer. So we're talking psychology, aren't we? On the psychological level, there is an exact correspondence between the Zen void and the dark night of John of the Cross. He appreciates Zen, and he understands that the void, that abyss, is really the true self. That abyss, that void, is really my experience of my union with God. It seems like nothing. And since God is, Jesus Christ included, is utterly beyond me, and I can imagine him, but that's not him, and that's not what I want. I want him, not as him as I imagine him to be. So I can't really have a concept of him that's him. I can't avoid having images of him, but I can't have an image of him that's him. But I can have him. But I can have him only without the images, without the concepts, and in the darkness. And that is the void that the Zen people get into. And that's the void they're talking about. And that's the true self. And that's my true self that the Zen people talk about and that Merton talks about. Although Merton means it a little differently. Because the difference, frankly, as you know, between Zen and Christian contemplation, the big difference There are lots of them. The big one is Jesus Christ. And for Merton, Christian contemplation is of Jesus Christ at the center of my soul, in union with me, and that's my true self, and that's what I'm trying to get to. Into a conscious awareness, however numb, however dark, however desolate, however anguished, however depressed or angry I feel, I still want to be there in that union with the Lord. And that's contemplative prayer for Merton. He thinks that, I'm trying to read the quotes, but since I left my notes again, I can't find them. He thinks that the Zen void and the dark night of John of the Cross are exactly the same. Well, I think he was wrong there. They're not the same. There's a big difference. But the experience is pretty much, it's very similar. I think the real correspondence between the void of Zen, the nothing of Zen, mu in Japanese, is the correspondence is not with John of the Cross's dark night, but with his doctrine of nothing. John of the Cross, he's got this doctrine of the nada, N-A-D-A, Spanish for nothing. I bet it sounds better when you say it in Spanish, right? Nada, the doctrine of the nada, John of the Cross. Nothing. What does that mean? It means nothing. It means when I'm going to God in contemplative prayer, I'm in a night because God is so great and so far beyond me and so brilliant and so much light that I can't see and I'm blinded. And I'm in a night. And all in this world, all my contemplative prayer is more or less in the dark. Even when I'm not in the dark night of the soul, I'm in the dark. The nada is, I don't want anything except the Lord. That's what I want. I want the Lord, and the rest, that's okay. I can let it go if I have to. The rest I can let and the Lord usually is found in the darkness, and you're back to the nada again. Does that correspond to a certain number of elements in Zen? Yes, I think it does. And that was one of Merton's insights. Well, I've come to the end, a little before I thought I would, and I'm looking over my notes to see if I missed anything important, and I did, but that's okay. We're going to stop right there. Does anybody have any questions? You have a question? Speak up so they can hear you.
The road where we have to pass the dragon.
The road where we have to pass the dragon.
Does that mean an example for us to choose the right one to get to the Lord?
Does that mean an example for us in life to choose the right one to get to the Lord? No. It's not so much choosing the right one, it's not getting off the road. Just because my prayer is a blank, just because my prayer is dark, just because my prayer maybe has anguish in it, or I'm sad, or I'm not happy, or as people say sometimes, quote unquote, I'm not getting anything out of my prayer. What am I doing here? I'm sitting here like a vegetable. I could be out playing golf, right? All that thing of Cyril of Alexandria says about the dragon is, you're on the road, you got to go by the dragon. Just because you see the dragon, don't get off the road. Don't stop praying. You got to go that way because it's the only road you got. How's that? It's a good metaphor. Yes, sir.
You made the poem that you read,
Yeah.
John the Crossian,
Right.
substituting
This poem by Christmas Humphreys, right.
substituting the word void with the word nothing,
Yeah, or nada. Yeah.
or nada.
Mm.
Earlier, when you began, you were saying that Teresa and John were of the same mold.
They are, yes. Teresa and John are same school.
I find it very difficult to think of Teresa having any idea of nada.
Right. So do I. The interlocutor has serious difficulty in thinking of Teresa as thinking of the nada, as thinking of being so apophatic, right? Of being thinking about nothing the way John of the Cross does. He seems to talk a lot about darkness and so on, and she doesn't. Her prayer is mostly light. It's two entirely different personalities. And this, again, is my experience, and so therefore subject to reevaluation with more experience, right? But I found that these two represent, Teresa and John represent two entirely different kinds of personality. John is, frankly, a kind of a depressive personality. He was. Teresa is extremely upbeat. She was a great organizer, a great administrator. She refounded her whole order. She founded all kinds of convents, and she had time to do that in the middle of a very intense contemplative life full of ecstasies and Lord knows what else, bone-wrenching spiritual experiences that she had. There was a lot of light in her life. And when you read the Interior Castle or the autobiography, you don't find much about these nights. They don't seem to be in there. My own feeling is that she passed through the fourth mansion and the night of the senses without really paying much attention to it. It's in there if you read it. And when she got to the sixth mansion, like in the Interior Castle, which is supposed to be the normal place for the passive night of the spirit, that she did go through that, but that she's more interested in the Lord than in what she's going through. Did she experience either night to the extent maybe that John of the Cross did? The void, yeah.
Does the void mean anything to her?
You'd really have to explain it a long time before she'd agree that the void would mean anything to her. I think so. Yes, I think that's true. But she wouldn't disagree with John of the Cross. She'd say he's right, and he'd say she's right, but you have to understand what they're saying. They are complementary, no question. Many people find John of the Cross a little too negative, too apophatic, too much on the nothing, and too much on darkness. But that is the experience of a lot of people, and it's valid as far as that goes. Teresa's experience was a little different, and it's not as common an experience. Merton's experience of contemplation was his own, and again, this doesn't correspond to everybody's either. Certainly not to Teresa of Avila. He was really neurotic, and she was really non-neurotic. Extraordinarily normal. She may have been a little neurotic at the beginning of her contemplative life, but she sure got over it fast. And let's have one last question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you mentioned about Thomas Merton's being neurotic and
Well, that's my opinion.
Yeah.
It was also the opinion of Gregory Zilberg, a famous Canadian psychiatrist.
yeah, and probably we all suffer a bit from it.
What's that?
We all suffer a bit from that too.
Right. We're all neurotic. It's a question of degree.
We carry that baggage with us. But I think what I hear you saying is that just because you have this baggage that you are carrying with us, it's not necessarily going to hinder you in your growth in prayer and your spiritual life.
Good point. Can I underline it? Whatever baggage you have, or don't have for that matter, John of the Cross had some, Teresa had very little, Merton had all kinds of it. Whatever neurotic baggage you're carrying, or for that matter psychotic, does that mean that you're blocked in your union with the Lord, or even in making progress in contemplative prayer? Can I answer it, and then that'll be the end? No, there have been some really loony people that have been great saints. The Venerable Lieberman, are there any sisters of Our Lady of Sion here? None. The Venerable Lieberman, who has he been canonized yet? They always call him the Venerable Lieberman. Anyway, he was a great saint, but they couldn't leave any sharp instruments in his room because he was suicidal. They'll never publish the diaries of Margaret Mary Alacoque, to whom the Lord revealed the Sacred Heart, because she was a clinical nut. And she was elected mistress to only one office in her convent during her whole life, in spite of being a great saint. She was made mistress of novices, but for only 1 year. Does that tell you something? 1 year, they kicked her out. She used to write little notes to sisters. For example, she'd write a little note and pass it to the sister, and it would say, "Jesus does not like you talking in times of silence." Well, she wasn't real popular, and she lacked some of the social graces. And she was also, if you read her own personal diaries, she was a fruitcake. Saint Teresa of Lisieux was certainly neurotic. So sometimes they call Teresa of Avila the big flower because they call Teresa of Lisieux the little flower. She was a great saint. And the first spiritual book I ever read was Thomas Merton's Seeds of Contemplation. And that was the first one that I studied. The first one I read was Teresa of Lisieux. And it changed my life. I think she's a great saint, but she was, let us say, averagely neurotic. She was a neurotic person. And that had an influence on her prayer. But it helped her spirituality insofar as it helped to mold her spirituality so that guys like me could get a hold of it and learn from it and go with it. Can I think of any other? Oh, yeah. Dave, who's the epitome of the normal person in Catholic sainthood and mysticism? It's Francis of Assisi. He was totally normal, super, mega, archy normal. He was so normal that everyone thought he was bonkers because he was more normal than anyone. The guy that's always considered normal is Ignatius of Loyola. They've done studies of him, and they've discovered that he was hopelessly neurotic. W.W. Meissner has done a psychoanalytical study. Other people have studied his handwriting, the things he wrote. He was a very fragmented personality in danger of falling apart totally, held together by a will of steel. But he wasn't what you would call a psychological paragon. And he was considered pretty normal. Does being neurotic really affect your spiritual life and your life with the Lord? Sure. Does it slow you down? Not necessarily. Does the Lord take it into account? Yes. Will it affect your experience in prayer, in contemplative prayer? Certainly. Is it going to hurt you? He's not going to let it. He loves you more than you could ever imagine. Thank you very much.
Your conclusion gives us much hope. At the Congress of International Spiritual Religious Leaders of many diverse faiths, they all agreed about the three main qualities required for an authentic spirituality. And one of the three requirements was to have a sense of thanksgiving. And the second one, a sense of humility. And the third one, a sense of humor. You certainly have got the third one. And even the second one, and very likely the first one. And we thank you for sharing them all with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you.